Good afternoon. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we began late and I'm going to try and keep to time. So welcome to this lunchtime session. My name's Daniel Hannan. I'm a British Conservative member of the European Parliament, editor of the Conservative magazine. Thank you all for being here, and congratulations to Amjad and to his staff for putting on this fantastic operation. I would argue that the central fact of politics over the last decade has been the rise on the left and the right of an anti-market populism of the kind that we hadn't experienced for decades. And I don't want to oversimplify. That rise has more than one single cause. But a large measure of what drove it was the financial crisis of 2008 and the way in which governments the world over responded to it. In the eyes of a lot of voters, the system was delegitimized. Money was taken through the tax system from low and medium income families in order, as it was perceived, to reward some very wealthy bankers and bondholders from the consequences of their own error. In other words, it seemed to vindicate the critique of the far left that the capitalist system was a sham and that it was all about keeping entrenched elites in positions of power. We're going to have a debate now on whether that could have been done differently, what the consequences would have been for good or ill. Were central banks the saviors who took the world from the brink of recession and restored financial order? Or were they the creators of the problem, having allowed interest rates to be too low for too long and thereby inflated the bubble in the first place? I'm delighted to be joined by two people who are perfectly qualified and placed to argue the respective sides of that case. I'm going to introduce both of them now and then hand over to them. So Jeff works for the IMF. There was probably the most famous of Bill Buckley's quotations, the great American conservative, is that he would rather be governed by 1,000 names chosen at random from the Boston telephone directory than by the economics faculty of Harvard University. So as a graduate of that faculty, Jeff will know that actually central bankers the world over tended to be graduates of Harvard or certainly adopted the same mentality. So he's in a way perfectly placed to tell us whether their collective attitude towards monetary policy was right or wrong. And Max Rangeley runs the Cobden Centre, which I'm very proud to be associated with. Richard Cobden was the great free trade radical in late Victorian Britain, and an example to all of the elected politicians in this room of how one man can change policy with sufficient determination. He took on a cause that was unpopular and unfashionable, and by sheer force of will and conviction, he brought others around to his point of view. The Cobden Centre has two great causes, one of which is Richard Cobden's crusade of free trade, but the other is sound money and particularly the critique of fractional reserve banking, which is the basis of the modern economy. So, gentlemen, I'm going to give you 12 minutes each, after which I'm going to cut you off. I'm going to be tough about the timing, because I want to leave time for a Q&A and questions from others.
The IMF, the institution that I represent here in Europe, is an institution that was born out of the most severe economic crisis of the 20th century. We've now just been through the second most severe crisis, the most severe since then. There are certainly lessons to be learned from both of these, but I think a lesson that we should take away from this is that central banks are not perfect institutions, but they are more part of the solution than part of the problem. Now, when we go back historically, the world economy functioned for thousands of years without central banks. Central banks are actually a relatively recent historical development, going back, say, 150 years or a bit more, or a bit less, depending upon how you define central banks. During that time period and before that time period, we had different kinds of monetary regimes. We had economic crises relatively regularly. If you look back at economic history of the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, you see quite acute, regular economic crises. And we can't blame them on central banks because, by and large, there weren't central banks in those days. To borrow a phrase from the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, I think one could argue that we had regular recessions that were nasty, brutish, and short. They were relatively short, but they were nasty and brutish. And central banks were developed in part to try to address those inadequacies. I think a further inadequacy that central banks were designed to address was the inadequacy of dealing with those crises. I think back to sort of 1907 when US President Theodore Roosevelt had to call J.P. Morgan to solve his financial crisis because the government of the United States of America did not have the capacity to do that. And that led directly to the development of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Now that we have more than 100 years of experience with central banks, I think we've got a track record that we can look back on. And the track record isn't universally positive, but I think you could make an argument that economic crises are less nasty, brutish, and short than they used to be. They may be a bit longer, in fact, because of the way in which we deal with them, but they're certainly less nasty and less brutish than they were before. Now, over time, we can't really take a central bank concept from 1900 and directly translate it today, because central banking has evolved significantly over these times. There are different governing principles, different anchors used for central banks, different policy tools that central banks use, different exchange rate regimes under which these central banks operate, and a different role of central banks vis-a-vis the financial sectors. But I think at the heart of modern central banking, I would argue there are three main components. The first one is money and monetary stability. Central banks clearly exist to address the issue of stable, reliable currencies that hold their value over time. And I think most modern central banks would define holding their value as keeping inflation under control. That's why many central banks today use an inflation targeting model as their anchor for monetary policy. The second key function that many, if not most, central banks follow is the idea that monetary policy can play a counter-cyclical role in the economics. That's making those recessions less nasty and less brutish by using monetary policy tools at their disposal. As one central banker humorously said once, the job of a good central banker is to take the punch bowl away just when the party's getting going. And I think that sort of sums in essence the ideal policy position of a central bank. A central bank should be looking to cool periods of overheating while allowing periods of deficient credit to be addressed by additional monetary resources. Now, some central banks go beyond this sort of just counter-cyclical role in general to look more specifically at the idea of promoting full employment. Many of you will be aware that the US Federal Reserve actually has a legal dual mandate. It has the inflation mandate, the price stability mandate, but it also has the full employment mandate. Interestingly enough, the central bank that pioneered inflation targeting in the world, New Zealand, and was very hard in their attachment to this single target, has recently modified their central bank target and has added an employment component to that, to look at sort of those both issues. The European Central Bank, of course, has the inflation component. But they've been interpreted in a way that you want to keep inflation not just not too high, but also not too low as well, which provides this counter-cyclical policy. The final area where central banks are involved is in the area of the financial sector. Max is going to have a very different view about how the financial sector and the central banks interact. But by providing the role of lender of last resort, the central banks have the ability to dampen financial booms and busts and to step in when financial crises would otherwise sink economic sectors. There's a reason why we deal with banks differently than we deal with industrial corporations. We deal with banks differently because when a corporation fails in manufacturing, consumers can simply go somewhere else and buy the product. There's almost always another supplier that they can buy for an equivalent price, and there's very little damage to the economy as a whole. But when a bank goes under, it's not just the shareholders of that bank, it's not just the lenders to that bank that go bad, it's all the people who've deposited their money in that bank that go down. And that has wider economic repercussions. It's an externality, we would say, in economic terms, that needs to be addressed with some counter-externality policy at a more governmental level. And so that financial sector role, which has extended in many central banks to banking supervision, is a very important one. Now, let me talk a little bit about how central banks have responded to the recent economic downturns. In the 1990s and into the early 2000s, there were many economists who addressed the fact that economic cycles seemed to be getting less severe and less common by declaring that the war against recessions had been done. That, in fact, this was called the Great Moderation at the time, and that the idea was that we have mastered the business cycle. Monetary and fiscal policy together, we had defeated the business cycle, and we wouldn't have these kinds of recessions. This even led in my institution to a downsizing of the IMF, because the view was we weren't going to be as needed in the future as we had been in the past. That turned out not to be the case. We had this major problem that built up and caused the second largest decline in the last 150 years. But I would say, looking back 10 years later on that crisis, we can say certainly that inadequate monetary policy in some countries and inadequate financial market supervision in some countries certainly contributed to the crisis. But looking back on this and saying, why did we not end up in another Great Recession? I think the single most important answer, why not? Why did we avoid a Great Recession? Was monetary policy responded differently. Milton Friedman's famous study of the Great Depression argued essentially that the reason why the Great Depression was as long as it was because monetary policy did not respond properly. And monetary policy in this crisis responded very aggressively, including with unconventional monetary policies. And I think largely single-handedly in some areas like the Eurozone, saved us from a great recession. I think it was a great fortune for the United States, for example, that one of the great scholars of the Great Depression, Ben Bernanke, just happened to be head of the Federal Reserve when this happened, and he could draw those lessons. Have central banks been perfect? No. Looking back, they should have done more to dampen financial bubbles before the crisis. Have they responded adequately to the crisis? I think the answer is, by and large, yes. By extremely aggressive monetary policy, they've kept the crisis from becoming deeper and longer than it would otherwise have been. And they have learned some lessons during the process that have changed the way they're going to manage financial sector booms and busts in the future. Having said that, then, looking forward, I think the scenarios are even more rosy for good central banking. Because having learned from the errors of the past, we're not likely to repeat those errors in the future. And we're less likely to have to suffer through the kinds of financial bubbles and booms that came about with insufficient financial sector regulation in the past. Thank you very much.
The counter-narrative has increasingly developed that maybe the effects of monetary policy have been at best mixed. Not only has monetary policy increased inequality and propped up inefficient companies, but that it's created an even larger asset bubble. In fact, some people say an asset bubble that dwarfs the asset bubble of 2008. Some of this commentary has even come from within the central banking establishment. The Bank for International Settlements, which is a central bank of central banks, has produced a number of papers showing that monetary policy has resulted in an even larger debt bubble. Global aggregate debt was about $150 trillion in 2008, and it's now $230 trillion. Bill White of the OECD has said that it's also resulted in debt dependency as a result of this in many economies, and that there's even larger bubbles in financial assets than there was in 2008. In his words, quite simply, the situation now is, quote, worse than 2007. Specifically with respect to QE, the Bank of England did a paper in 2012 which found that around 40% of all the proceeds of QE had gone to the wealthiest 5% in society. But as well as this, there's been an intellectual shift over the last few years. Perhaps more importantly than that, there's been a renewed interest in economists some from generations ago, who pointed out the systemic negative effects of central banking. So I suspect many of you here today will be familiar with Friedrich von Hayek. He wrote, his most famous work is The Road to Serfdom, which sold more than 2 million copies, making it one of the most popular political books of the 20th century. When Margaret Thatcher first became leader of the Conservative Party, at a presentation by a member of the Conservative Research Department, she's said to have pulled out a copy of The Constitution of Liberty by Hayek, put it on the table, and said, "This is what we believe in." But more of interest for us today is the work for which Hayek won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974. And that's his work in how central banks distort the economy. Now, to understand this, you just need to understand that in every area in which price fixing has happened, it's failed. So we've had governments setting the prices of food, fuel, housing, and many other sectors through the 1970s and beyond, and it's always ended in disaster. In fact, this goes back millennia. So the Edict of Diocletian in the year 301 set prices in ancient Rome and resulted in widespread hunger and shortages. Thinkers at the time, such as Lactantius, had pointed out in advance that this would happen. And the reason for this is that prices in a market economy coordinate scarce resources. So prices are crucial to a market economy. If you take, for example, something like butter, the higher the supply of butter, all other things being equal, the lower the price will be. If the demand for butter suddenly goes up, then the price will rise to accommodate that. And of course, when the price goes up, that brings down demand, and it also increases supply. So prices are constantly coordinating the market. And when a government steps in and sets the price of something, it causes a mismatch. So if the government was to step in and set the price of butter too low, that means it gives the illusion of abundance. So more people will want butter than there is butter available, and fewer companies will produce it. So it causes a mismatch. So in other words, artificial price setting by governments causes false signals to be sent to the market. Now, if we look at interest rates, in a true free market, interest rates would be set by the amount of saving and the demand for borrowing in an economy. So the more people who are saving, that would bring down interest rates. On the other hand, if there's a surge in demand for debt, then interest rates then go up to accommodate that. So that brings down that demand for debt. It would also increases savings because interest rates have gone up. But as well as this, interest rates also coordinate the time preferences in an economy. So let's say a lot of people are saving. That then brings down the interest rate because there's more savings available to borrow. But what it also does is it gives a signal to the market that people are delaying their consumption until future time periods, i.e. savings is up, people are saving, so they're going to be consuming more in the future. So just as interest rates come down, businesses can borrow more and invest on a longer time horizon. So interest rates also perform this function. They coordinate the time preferences of the entire economy. So when a central bank sets interest rates, it distorts this mechanism. So similar to when the government sets the price of other things in an economy like butter, when a central bank sets interest rates, it results in more debt being generated than there is savings available in the economy. So this, like other forms of price setting, is sending false signals to the economy. So a recent example would be the housing bubble in the US. So with the 1% interest rates around 2003 and 4 set by the Federal Reserve, that resulted in more houses being built than was justified by the amount of savings in the economy and the amount of resources in the economy. So at that point, the bust was inevitable. We're now seeing, with years of zero interest rates, we're seeing the same thing happen with consumer debt, with corporate debt, with stock market bubbles, and with bond bubbles. In the words of Andrew Haldane, who's the chief economist at the Bank of England, and I quote this word for word, "We have intentionally blown the biggest government bond bubble in history." Now, he also went on to say that a disorderly bursting of this bubble was the greatest risk to global financial stability. But of course, from Hayek's perspective, it's central banks creating these massive bubbles, which is the threat to stability. Once a central bank sets interest rates too low, you inevitably end up with a bubble, and that bubble will burst at some point. An economist whose thoughts also fed into this and influenced Hayek was Richard Cantillon. He was writing during the 18th century in France, and the Cantillon effect says that when new money is created, the people who receive that money first benefit disproportionately. So in other words, in the days of the French royal court, it was the people around the king. They will receive that money. They can then spend that money into the economy or invest it before prices go up. These days in the 21st century, with zero interest rates and quantitative easing, it tends to be hedge funds and the financial sector which benefit disproportionately. So they receive this newly created money, and they can then invest it in stocks or bonds before the prices go up in the economy. So that's also, when this new money is created, those institutions which receive it first, they will tend to pull in resources from other sectors of the economy. So again, when Cantillon was writing in the 18th century, that was the people closest to the court. Well, these days, when you hear of people with PhDs in mathematics and physics going to work for a hedge fund, that's because when a hedge fund can borrow money at 0% interest rates, at artificially low rates, they can leverage up massively. So their profits are artificially high. They're higher than they would be if we had a free market in interest rates. So these people with PhDs in physics who should be doing something productive in society, they end up moving towards those parts of the economy who receive the newly created money. So some people ask, with all this money creation, why has there not been generalized inflation? Well, the reason is that if a hedge fund manager made $50 million this year, he doesn't go out and buy 50 million packets of crisps. So you don't see that general inflation. On the other hand, Knight Frank have estimated that art prices, since the beginning of 0% interest rates, have gone up by 252%. And classic car prices have gone up by an incredible 487%. You also see in things like high-end London housing and other areas where the people who have received this money first are going to be spending money, there is actually inflation, even on a Chavez level, really, 500%. So in the days of Richard Cantillon and the French royal court, they of course had let them eat cake, whereas in the days of hedge funds and quantitative easing, I think that now needs to be updated to let them eat collateralized debt obligations, because that's where we are now. They're the receivers of this new money. So inflation, in a sense, general inflation, is in many ways the least damaging effect of money creation. Many conservatives talk about printing money as causing it. Of course, it does cause inflation eventually. But the more damaging effect is these distortions that it causes, pulling resources from productive parts of the economy. I gave a seminar at the OECD and the IMF in December, and several of the economists there actually said that this tallied with their work, looking at the number of inefficient companies in the economy and the number of so-called zombie companies, that these companies, through artificially cheap credit, are able to just pull in resources from productive sectors of the economy. Friedrich von Hayek said that essentially the fundamental problem for a centrally planned economy is that it's impossible for the central planners to have the required knowledge to plan that economy. And that's what we have with central bankers setting interest rates. So it's not so much the individual policy errors by central bankers that have caused this, as much as it is a defective system. Central bankers setting interest rates for an entire economy are essentially in the same position that Gosplan was in the Soviet Union. They simply can't do it because this type of economic model doesn't work. So the recent recession was not some confluence of events. It was the result of a generation of monetary policy. Over the last generation, each recession has resulted in cutting interest rates. But then after the recession, they raise interest rates, but not back to where they were before. So over the last generation, economies have become more and more addicted to debt. So that debt stimulus, it becomes like a drug stimulus. Each time you need a stronger dose just to achieve the same effect. So that's why now we're at 0% interest rates. So we're coming to the end of this line now. That's why we have this $230 trillion of global debt. In some cases now we're even having economies moving into negative interest rates, the reductio ad absurdum of all modern monetary economics. This, of course, would occur nowhere in nature. It is an aberration to all market economics. So the economic problems that we have today are as a result of this debt bubble. In the words of Claudio Borio, who is the chief monetary economist at the Bank for International Settlements, debt was at the root of the financial crisis, and it has risen further globally in relation to GDP since then. So in other words, stuffing the economy with more and more debt, like foie gras, is not going to solve the problem. We're coming to the end of this model very soon. And to conclude, if the IMF were called in to help a country which was in distress, the last thing that they would suggest would be setting up price-setting committees for food, fuel, housing, consumer goods, and other sectors of the economy. When Venezuela sets the price of food or fuel, we're not surprised when they have shortages. So when central banks set interest rates at 0%, we shouldn't be surprised that we have a $230 trillion global debt bubble. If you go to the website of this event today, you'll see at the top a great quote from Margaret Thatcher, who said, "There can be no liberty unless there is economic liberty." But can we really say that we're in a free economy if we have a committee of economists setting interest rates which affect mortgage payments, house prices, stock prices, consumer and corporate borrowing, and transfer billions, if not trillions of dollars from productive parts of the economy to the financial sector? So I would argue this is just as important as the economic problems caused by monetary policy. A free society requires economic freedom, and central planning committees setting prices are the negation of economic freedom. Thank you.